Imagine this: in 1945, the world gathered to form the United Nations, promising peace, equality, and a new beginning for humanity. Yet, while decisions about the future were being written, most of Africa had no voice. 80 years later, here we are in 2025 commemorating the UN's 80th anniversary, and Africa, the very continent whose crises dominate the Security Council's agenda, still holds no permanent seat at that table. How can this be called justice? How can an institution claim universality while excluding 1/4 of its membership and more than 1 billion people? This is not just about numbers. It is about dignity, legitimacy, and the credibility of the United Nations itself. Every year, resolutions about African wars, African peacekeeping, African sanctions, and African futures are passed by a council where Africa remains voiceless. Leaders from Sierra Leone, Angola, Namibia, Uganda, Nigeria, Zambia, Congo, and beyond have reminded the world Africa is not asking for charity. Africa is demanding its rightful place, and make no mistake, this is not negotiable. The Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, forged 20 years ago, stand as Africa's united blueprint for reform. The demand is simple yet profound: at least 2 permanent seats with full rights, and additional non-permanent seats to reflect today's realities, not the world of 1945. So tonight, as the UN celebrates 8 decades of existence, the question is unavoidable: will history record this generation as the one that corrected a profound injustice, or as the one that let the United Nations drift into irrelevance? Stay with us, because what Africa's leaders said in New York this week could redefine not only the UN, but the balance of global power itself. Please share this video if you believe Africa's demand is just and long overdue. And subscribe if you think the truth matters more than political convenience. The streets of New York bustled as world leaders gathered for the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. Inside the walls of the UN headquarters, however, the air was heavier, thicker with anticipation and the weight of history. On that stage, Africa stood not as fragmented voices, but as a united front. From Sierra Leone to Angola, from Namibia to Uganda, the leaders of the African Union's Committee of 10, better known as the C10, delivered one clear and unwavering message: Africa's exclusion from the Security Council cannot continue. It was President Julius Maada Bio of Sierra Leone, serving as coordinator of the C10, who framed the moment with striking clarity. He reminded the Assembly that when the UN was born in 1945, most African nations were still under colonial rule. Decisions were made about our continent without us, he declared, and 80 years later we still live under that shadow. The words rang heavy. After all, more than 70% of Security Council agenda items deal directly with Africa, yet the continent has no permanent seat. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Following him, Angolan President João Lourenço, current chairperson of the African Union, pressed the urgency further. He pointed to the 20 years since the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, when African leaders first united around a common position on UN reform. "We have waited long enough," he said firmly. The credibility of the United Nations itself now rests on correcting this injustice. Namibia's President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah emphasized that Africa was not seeking favors, but rightful recognition. She spoke of the legitimate non-negotiable and just demand for at least 2 permanent seats with full voting rights, plus additional non-permanent seats. Equal representation for Africa, she warned, is not only an African imperative, it is a global necessity. From Congo to Zambia, one theme echoed Africa's unity. Congo's delegation reminded the audience that the Security Council has consistently failed to resolve conflicts in an equitable way, and that widening representation was the only path to restore its moral authority. Zambia's foreign minister, speaking on behalf of President Hakainde Hichilema, laid out a 3-part strategy: high-level political engagement, coalition building through multilateral platforms like the Non-Aligned Movement and G77, and sharper, clearer diplomatic messaging. Africa's demand, he insisted, is not a matter of charity. It is justice. It is history waiting to be corrected. Nigeria's foreign minister brought a sense of reflection. He acknowledged the progress made. Africa has broadened global support, fostered recognition of its unique case, and proven through mechanisms like the A3 that it is ready to shoulder responsibility in global security. But he warned of stagnation, describing the Security Council as a body on the verge of paralysis. The call was unmistakable delay no longer. What made this summit different was not only the speeches but the symbolism. 20 years after the African Union's roadmap for reform, Africa still speaks with one voice. 54 nations, more than a quarter of the UN's membership, have not fractured on this issue. This solidarity in a world often defined by division is Africa's greatest strength. The message from New York was not timid, nor polite diplomacy meant to appease the great powers. It was bold, urgent, and unflinching. Africa will not reach the 100th anniversary of the United Nations, still excluded, one leader warned. The implication was clear: if the UN fails to act, Africa may look elsewhere, to regional alliances, to BRICS, to its own institutions, to shape the future of global governance. For the global audience watching, this was more than a routine meeting. It was a reckoning. The leaders of Africa had stood together to remind the world that the UN cannot remain frozen in 1945. If it does, it risks losing the very legitimacy on which it was built. The summit in New York reached its emotional peak when African leaders, one after another, moved beyond diplomatic politeness and spoke with a passion rarely heard in UN chambers. The words were no longer framed as requests or proposals. They were declarations charged with history, urgency, and a refusal to wait another generation. The crescendo came with a simple but thunderous truth: Africa is not asking for a handout. Africa is demanding its rightful place. The room fell silent, not because the words were unexpected, but because of the force with which they were delivered. For decades, Africa's appeals for reform had been diluted by the language of negotiation. This time, the leaders drew a red line. The demand for at least 2 permanent seats was described as non-negotiable. Uganda's vice president gave perhaps the starkest warning: if reforms were delayed until the UN's 100th anniversary, the organization itself would stand on the brink of irrelevance. How can we celebrate 100 years of the United Nations while perpetuating 100 years of injustice, she asked. The rhetorical question cut deeply, not just at the legacy of the UN, but at its very survival as a credible institution. As the speeches grew sharper, the reactions around the chamber revealed the fault lines of global politics. Diplomats from the global South, Latin America, Asia, the Caribbean nodded in visible agreement. Many of their nations, too, feel marginalized in a system that privileges the victors of World War II. Representatives from the G77 and non-aligned movement were quick to applaud, signaling that Africa's case is no longer an isolated plea, but part of a larger push for a new, fairer, multilateral order. From the permanent members, however, the responses were more muted. The United States and the United Kingdom offered carefully worded statements acknowledging Africa's important role, yet stopped short of endorsing structural reform. France, which carries its own complicated colonial legacy in Africa, chose silence rather than risk fueling further resentment. By contrast, Russia and China, keen to expand their influence on the continent, expressed conditional support, framing it as part of their broader advocacy for a multipolar world. This split underscored the tension at the heart of the debate. The very powers that hold veto authority are the same ones who stand to lose relative influence if Africa joins the permanent circle. Still, African leaders made clear that delay is no longer acceptable. We cannot recycle entrenched positions, Namibia's president said firmly. Consensus must produce outcomes, not more words. The emotional weight of the summit was heightened by references to Africa's sacrifices. Leaders reminded the world that African troops, African peacekeepers, and African civilians have borne the cost of conflicts that the Security Council debates day after day. To exclude the continent from decision-making while demanding its blood and resources, they argued, is not just hypocrisy, it is a moral failure. Observers noted how the speeches galvanized a sense of unity, not only among Africans, but also across much of the developing world. Social media feeds lit up with hashtags calling for Motorch Justice for Africa and Motorch UN Reform Now. Commentators in Western outlets admitted that the symbolism of 54 nations speaking with one voice was impossible to ignore. The pressure was no longer theoretical. It was visible, audible, undeniable. By the close of the session, the message was seared into the consciousness of the global community. Africa's patience had run out. If the UN Security Council continues to exclude Africa, it is not Africa that risks irrelevance, it is the UN itself. As the applause faded in New York, the echoes of Africa's demand reverberated far beyond the UN chamber. On the streets of Ouagadougou, Lagos, Kinshasa, and Johannesburg, citizens followed the headlines with a mix of pride and urgency. For ordinary Africans, this debate was not abstract diplomacy. It was about dignity, visibility, and the right to shape a future that has too often been decided elsewhere. Civil society groups immediately seized on the summit's momentum. Student unions from Nairobi to Accra organized teach-ins reminding young Africans that the exclusion of their continent from the Security Council was not just a technical flaw, but a living injustice. How can we talk about global peace, one student leader asked, when the very people who pay the price in blood are denied a permanent voice at the table? Across universities, this sentiment ignited discussions about sovereignty, responsibility, and the next generation's role in global governance. Politically, the summit also strengthened the African Union's internal cohesion. For 2 decades, skeptics had warned that Africa's diversity, 54 nations, dozens of languages, multiple political systems would eventually fracture its common stance. But the C10 summit proved the opposite. The unity around the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration has held firm. Leaders from across the continent, whether democratically elected presidents or transitional heads of state, stood shoulder to shoulder. That unity is now both a political shield and a negotiating weapon. The implications for Africa's domestic politics are profound. Governments that had long been accused of silence or complacency on international reform can now point to this collective stand as proof of their commitment to justice. Opposition groups, activists, and journalists have found in this moment a rallying cry, an opportunity to press their leaders not only to demand seats abroad, but also to deliver justice and equality at home. In this sense, the call for Security Council reform has become a mirror forcing African states to reflect on whether they themselves embody the principles of inclusion and legitimacy. There are risks, too. If the UN continues to resist, frustration among African publics could deepen into disillusionment. Already, polls show declining trust in global institutions across the continent. Many young Africans see more hope in BRICS, in the African Union, or in regional blocs like the Alliance of Sahel States than in a UN that still mirrors the power map of 1945. Should reform stall indefinitely, the UN may accelerate its own marginalization in Africa, pushing the continent to seek alternative platforms for influence and partnership. For the international community, the political cost is clear. The African question has shifted from being a regional demand to a test of the UN's very credibility. Every year of delay fuels suspicion that the Permanent Five are clinging to outdated privileges at the expense of justice. And every speech, every summit where Africa speaks with one voice reinforces the pressure. In the end, the civil and political consequences of this movement converge on a single truth. Africa's call is no longer just about a chair in the Security Council. It is about reclaiming history, repairing dignity, and reshaping the rules of global power. If ignored, the result may be not only an emboldened Africa outside the UN, but a weakened United Nations struggling to explain why it failed to evolve. From Washington's perspective, the African demand for Security Council reform presents a paradox. On one hand, the United States has long championed the rhetoric of democracy, equality, and inclusion in global governance. On the other, endorsing 2 permanent African seats would inevitably dilute American influence inside the UN's most powerful body. For many U.S. policymakers, this is the uncomfortable truth. Supporting Africa's claim would strengthen legitimacy but weaken control. That tension explains why America's official response in New York was cautious, carefully worded to acknowledge Africa's importance without committing to structural change. Privately, however, diplomats admit a growing concern. If Washington continues to block or stall reform, it risks losing Africa altogether. Already, African states have deepened ties with China, Russia, India, and the Gulf. A refusal to recognize Africa's rightful place at the UN could accelerate this pivot, leaving the U.S. sidelined in the very regions it considers strategically vital. For Europe, the situation is equally complicated. France, once dominant in West and Central Africa, faces mounting hostility from governments and publics who view its silence on UN reform as hypocrisy layered upon colonial arrogance. Britain, grappling with its post-Brexit identity, has little leverage left. Germany and the European Union broadly support reform in principle, but lack the power to push it through without consensus from the Permanent Five. The longer reform stalls, the weaker Europe appears in African eyes. Russia and China, by contrast, see opportunity. Moscow has openly voiced support for Africa's claim, framing it as part of the broader struggle against Western dominance. Beijing, which has cultivated infrastructure projects and trade across the continent, signals sympathy while carefully avoiding commitments that might provoke Washington. Both powers recognize that aligning with Africa's demand enhances their credibility as partners of the Global South. For them, this debate is less about principle and more about influence. Beyond the major powers, the reaction from the broader world has been strikingly favorable to Africa. The G77, the non-aligned movement, and much of Latin America and Asia have echoed Africa's call, understanding that reform would open doors for their own aspirations. For these nations, Africa's fight is symbolic of a wider struggle, ending the monopoly of the few and reshaping international institutions to reflect 21st century realities. The global media response has been divided. Western outlets framed the summit as an important but unlikely push for reform, hinting that entrenched powers would never surrender their privileges. African, Asian, and Latin American outlets, however, covered it as a watershed moment, evidence that the Global South is no longer whispering but demanding justice in unison. Ultimately, the world now faces a test. Will the Permanent Five cling to the architecture of 1945, or will they accept that legitimacy in the 21st century requires inclusion? For America, especially, the stakes are high. By resisting reform, Washington may secure short-term influence, but at the cost of long-term trust. By supporting it, the U.S. could rebuild bridges with Africa and demonstrate that its values extend beyond slogans. One thing is clear: Africa's demand is not just Africa's problem. It is a global reckoning, and how the world responds will shape the credibility of the United Nations for generations to come. 80 years after the founding of the United Nations, the world stands at a crossroads. The speeches in New York were not routine calls for reform. They were warnings. If the UN continues to operate with the architecture of 1945, it risks becoming a relic, an institution that speaks of universality but practices exclusion. Africa's absence in the Security Council is not a minor oversight. It is a wound that undermines the very credibility of the UN itself. What happens if this injustice is left unresolved? Already young Africans are questioning the value of global institutions that deny them representation. Already governments are exploring alternatives, regional alliances, BRICS, and new security frameworks that bypass New York entirely. If the Permanent Five continue to stall, the future may not be a stronger UN, but a fractured international order, where Africa, home to the fastest-growing population and vast resources, builds its destiny elsewhere. And yet this moment also carries promise. The unity displayed by 54 African states proves that solidarity is stronger than cynicism. By standing together, Africa has reminded the world that legitimacy comes not from power alone, but from fairness. The question now is whether the rest of the world, especially the United States and its allies, will recognize this turning point. Will they choose to correct history, or will they cling to privileges that erode their own moral authority? For audiences in America, the challenge is personal. Do you believe that the UN can remain credible if Africa, a continent that represents over 1 billion people and a quarter of UN membership, remains voiceless in its most powerful body? Do you think the United States should support Africa's rightful place or risk watching the continent drift toward other powers that promise respect? History will remember what happens next. Either this generation of leaders will be celebrated for ending a long injustice or condemned for allowing it to fester into the UN's decline. The choice is still open, but the time is running out. Please share this video if you feel Africa's call is just and overdue. Subscribe if you believe the truth must finally be heard inside the United Nations. And let us know in the comments, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for Africa's rightful place in global governance is the future, or should another leader take the baton to finish what he started?